I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at, I think I can safely say, a fairly weird piece of writing.
Safe.
I think we talk about a lot of weird writing out here, actually. But this is from a late Qing dynasty reformer. When I say late Qing, I mean right towards the end of the 19th century.
Yeah, I think it was first published, the first draft was put out there in 1901, 1902.
But it was repressed until the 30s.
Yeah.
In English, the translation is the Book of Great Harmony.
The Da Tong Shu.
Da Tong Shu by the reformer Kang Youwei. Now, Kang Youwei is a major figure, one of the most important intellectuals in the late Qing. He and Liang Qichao, or probably Liang Qichao, are maybe the two biggest.
And Liang Qichao was his student.
Yeah. Because they form a bridge between sort of an older way of doing scholarship and a new way of doing it.
We might say that older way is Confucianism, although use of that term is kind of, funny. We have to be very careful.
We use it kind of as a shorthand because I'm not sure how we would refer to some of these strains of thought without it. But, in most, I think that the accepted practice now is that Confucianism, it was never an ism at all. So, but Kang Youwei especially is linked to an intellectual trend up into the 1850s at least, if not later. The effects linger much longer.
What's the name of that tradition?
It's got a lot of translations. The Chinese, the Kaozheng, which sort of is like evidentiary scholarship. And it's basically philology. And for those who aren't sure about the term philology, it's essentially research into words, word histories, word roots, word whatever.
Yeah, I've oftentimes had Chinese people tell me that it's essentially like the Chinese invented science long before the West had it, and they call it Kaozheng.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge stretch, but it's a more similar to science in some of its methodologies, but it's applied mostly to the study of kind of old writing and older forms of Chinese thought.
And what's important to stress about it is that it was mostly used this period in essentially determining which part of these classical texts that we've always used to structure our society were actually written when they were said to have been written. Because a lot of what they had, they realized had been transmitted and changed over various dynasties. And these scholars are trying to establish, say, the real Analects by Confucius, or the real I Ching, the Book of Changes, the Classic of Changes, to varying degrees of success. But what's really important about it, I think, in terms of the discussion we're going to have today, is that was the limit. If you were a philological scholarship, you did not make any kind of pronouncements on morals or ethics. It was not your job to say, okay, now that we've established what the Analects say, like what are the words on the page, what do we do with them? That was somebody else's thing. This is not something you did. And so the scholarship was always facing the past and never, ever made any pronouncements on the present.
Although discussions of the past in China, as in other places, even in the United States, are always kind of inherently linked with talking about current.
But the Kaozheng scholars were pretty scrupulous about not making direct pronouncements about anything that's happening. Which is why Kang Youwei is peculiar, because Kang Youwei trained in this tradition, mid-19th century.
And he's quite the philologist,
He was quite the philologist. He wrote a couple of documents demonstrating the falsity of some of the classical materials.
In some ways, this is kind of like the Renaissance. This Kaozheng scholarship is kind of like Renaissance humanism that's coming out, like the donation of Constantine, or the discovery that the donation of Constantine was a forgery, that kind of stuff.
Right, yeah. We can't say we have this text unless we can guarantee ourselves that we know exactly where it came from and everything else to do with it, right? Mm. Where Kang Youwei steps in and does something a little different is he does write in this tradition, but he begins to be a lot more concerned with what's going on in China at that present time. Now, when he's making this transition, of course, would have been roughly the time of the Opium Wars, in which major Western powers dominate China, essentially. Dominate trade, open treaty ports, etc. And so Kang Youwei begins thinking, okay, look, it isn't that Chinese culture's bankrupt or anything. We actually have the stuff we need. We're just not using it in a way that's actually going to help us. And this Da Tong Shu, it's just called Great Unity, Da Tong.
Right.
You have something?
Yeah, I mean, we should first point out that the word Da Tong, Great Unity, is itself coming out of Confucius.
It's coming out of Confucius, yeah.
And it's kind of like great unity, but also kind of implies kind of peace and harmonious relationships, all that kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so he's using a concept originally from Confucius, and he's essentially applying it to world history, from the beginning of time to the end of time. And the single unifying force in all of this history is Ren, R-E-N. But this is a different Ren. There's two different pronouncements of Ren. One is like a person, but this Ren means closer to something like benevolence, compassion, humaneness.
Although sometimes I've heard it translated confusingly as personhood.
Yeah, it's a really hard one to translate.
It is, yeah. It does have the radical, the part of the word for person in it. So it's the combination of the word person and the word to. So there's this kind of what it means to be in society and like how society functions. It's almost like if we could take Star Wars lingo,
of course,
it would be the Force.
It would be the Force.
It would be the thing that the thing that unites all things.
And yet, and this is the debate when we read Kang Youwei, we read this book. He takes it a good bit further. It's not just a quality that good people have, like good members of society have in practice. Mm-hmm. In Kang Youwei's writing, he's bringing in elements of European science and psychology, Japanese scholarship, and so in the Da Tong Shu, his book, this Ren is literally a force. He actually compares it to electricity. It grounds everything. And this is way more radical than the word had ever been positioned before. It also opens up the book because now you're not writing about this one Confucian concept. This is now true for all things, all of reality, everywhere.
If I could jump in here with another comparison to Western literature.
Yes.
It's kind of similar to Dante's discussion of love, in that it's this force that unites all people that comes out of, and it has both positive and I would say there are some, I mean, the lack of love and the lack of Ren would be quite a negative thing, but it's a force.
Yeah. Now, he does not go into a lot of detail about this. That it's a force is not the main idea of his work.
Tell us a little bit about this text and what is its main point.
So the main point is it's a world history, and it's essentially a utopia.
It's absolutely it.
It's very much utopian. In this scheme, there's three periods of history. There's the age of disorder, the age of order, and the age of great peace. And the age of great peace for Kang Youwei is one where this Ren reigns supreme. Everything is harmonious. Everything is in order. Now, what's really weird about his scheme of world history is that in his scheme, this era of great peace, this age of great peace, will have essentially none of the institutions or basic norms of society or even nature we would think of. So,
sort of, right?
Sort of, but explain what you mean.
One of the interesting things is he explains how life will be handled, how the life cycle will be handled. And he has kind of women going into these essentially birthing centers, and you give birth. Women don't have a choice of whether or not they can give birth. That's their job. Abortion is very illegal, and it's the greatest crime in Da Tong Shu. But women are, supposed to be treated well. They're kind of like kept. Nice music is being played for them constantly.
Not music, but
just, No, it's essentially music. That's actually probably. Okay. I mean, I don't know.
This sounds more like hell than utopia, but
Kenny G.
Worse.
Anyway, so, like women have babies, and then the babies are sort of taken away from them. Family is completely eliminated in the Da Tong Shu. So in that sense, it's quite radical. These babies are just taken into institutions. But the final stage of life it's essentially like a mourning stage. It's like those who have enjoyed the great unity, like send off, or something like that, which is very kind of Chinese ritualistic mourning, emphasis on mourning. It seems very strange to us that you have to have this whole separate stage of mourning, but it makes sense if you're talking about a Chinese writer who has been trained in Confucian pedagogy.
And the example that Lee gives here, which is one section of the book, where life is essentially scripted out, is important because he uses this example of how life actually works for each being as an analog for the way all of society, all of the world should function.
And when you say all of the world, we should mention
it's the world.
All of the world.
So what's eliminated here in this book? Everything is eliminated. I'm going to read a translation of it, which we'll try to post the bibliographical information in case you want to read it. But in the great commonality, which is his term for, Datong, the great unity, there will be no states. There will be no rulers. There will be no cases of opposing the superior and creating rebellion. There will be no husbands and wives, and so there will be no fighting over sexual desire, no provisions against sexual immorality, etc., etc. There will be no family relationships, and so there will be no need to support, no compulsion to do the right thing. There will be no nobility. There will be no private property. There will be no burial of the dead. There will be no customs barriers. There will be no class divisions. And towards the end, he even says there will not even be species divisions. Homo sapiens will no longer be a thing. We will simply think of ourselves as part of nature.
One of the things that I found most disturbing that he's eliminating is all black and brown people.
He does actually use those terms.
Yeah, and he's going to, China at this time, like much of the rest of the world, is thinking a lot about eugenics. And this book is no exception. There, I think over a period of like 1,000 years, black and brown people will essentially be bred out of existence.
Right. That's his. Either one of the questions in relation to this is the degree to which he is saying that this should be something that all of us consciously participate in doing, or whether this Ren, this force, will simply guarantee it's going to happen one way or the other. This is a discussion actually that comes up because Kang Youwei writes this book as a utopia. So this is, we have the past, the present, and the future. This will be the end of all things, this era. We're going here. There's no way we're not going to go here, right? But if you have a utopia, a thing that's inevitable, why would you then push for any kind of active reform? Because it's inevitable, right? This is one of the things that when Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin debate in the 19th century, Bakunin, who was an anarchist, that's one of the things he says. As long as you have this great inevitable process, so why should any of us actually participate in it? But Kang Youwei actually plans out and executes a political reform movement, the 100 Days Reform.
Right, but so that reform happened and it was unsuccessful.
It was unsuccessful.
He has been writing the Datong Shu for some period. He's been working on ideas in it long before that reform, which occurred in 1898.
Right.
As the name 100 Days Reform suggests, these reforms didn't last long, and that wasn't because they were so awesome and successful that everybody immediately adopted them, right, Rob?
No, it was not. It was not particularly well thought out. Although what's funny about it is that so Kang didn't push for the era of great peace. He essentially said, look, China's kind of backward. We're really kind of still in somewhere in between the age of disorder and the age of order. So what we kind of need to shoot for is actually just the middle stage. That needs to be our goal, because most of the Western powers, they're kind of already there. Like a Republican style of government clearly puts you into the next stage and beyond. We need to get somewhere like there, like attainable goals.
And when he does that, he tries to do that, but it doesn't work.
No, he writes a memorial to the emperor in 1898, which is not appreciated.
Well, it is appreciated at first, but then that emperor is essentially overthrown by Empress Dowager Cixi.
The one that everyone loves to hate
in
Chinese history.
And there are always these women who get blamed for everything in Chinese history. She essentially overthrows her son.
Yeah.
And imprisons him, I believe. And Kang Youwei is forced to flee to Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
Which brings up another interesting discussion, because when we talk about reform, political reform in China, we have to talk about Japan. Today, Japan and China have this sort of on the table, we really don't like each other, we're historical enemies thing. Under the table, we're going to kind of sell each other a lot of stuff and all that. But in the turn of the 20th century, from 19th to 20th, most, if not all, reformers, scholars, intellectuals who knew anything about the outside world either studied in Japan or got stuff from Japan.
Almost all of them studied in Japan.
Almost all of them actually physically were in Japan.
And, I mean, Japan provides this kind of refuge because the Qing dynasty government is very resistant to change, as this 100 Days Reform thing suggests. I mean, after 100 days, they essentially tried to capture and kill everyone who was involved in the reform.
Right.
So Japan, you're right, played this crucial role as this refuge for people who were thinking through things, thinking how is China going to change. Mm-hmm. They could live there and not be killed. Sun Yat-sen, for some period, was in
Liang
Japan.
Qichao and Kang Youwei actually put out a journal there together.
And we've mentioned people like Lu Xun, who is a later figure, a contemporary of theirs. But
although actually was in Japan at roughly the same time. He was translating literature and I believe preparing for his medical studies.
But he's much younger.
Yeah, he's a much younger figure, but he was there at roughly the same time, 1902.
I lived in a small apartment complex in Qingdao, just around the corner from where he was buried. He died in Qingdao, which is a city on the Shandong Peninsula, kind of halfway in between.
It's a really nice city.
Shanghai and Beijing. Yeah, a very kind of fun place to go in the summer. So Kang Youwei is buried there.
Yes.
And it's interesting because when I went to his grave, just around the corner from my apartment, no one is there and it's not taken care of. And it's kind of interesting, his legacy, Kang is not 100% loved. I mean, he's seen as a reformer and someone who was trying to change China, but he's seen as someone who didn't make it.
Well, and one of the reasons why is because at no point in his career does he say, as a good May 4th scholar would say, Confucius is a bad idea. Basically, if you're reading Confucius, you're a part of the past. He needs to be stopped. And Kang Youwei, but in what makes him disagreeable to May 4th scholars, but really interesting to everybody else is, he's using Confucius and several Confucian concepts to ground his thought, but he's doing them in such a progressive and bizarre way that in some ways he exceeds any of the modernizing projects of the May 4th writers.
In Da Tong Shu, I believe, he explicitly says, I am Chinese, therefore I choose Confucius.
Yeah.
So he's very much wedding this concept of Chineseness with Confucianism. But he is definitely also jettisoning a lot of other things that I think his readers would have thought of as Chinese, like the family. What does Confucianism mean if
Without
the family is eliminated? I mean, Confucianism is built around family. So when you get rid of that, when you get rid of gender, which is one of the main dynamics in Confucianism, what does Confucianism even mean?
Yeah, and that's... Well, we could even bring up again the fact that for most scholars of classical Chinese now, Confucianism isn't even a thing. And this perhaps points out one of the reasons why, is because this is someone who's trained in it and is advocating stuff that the rest of us, if we were to read some of Confucius, would go, what in the world does this have to do with Confucius? But this is someone who's taking a lot of different concepts, throwing them together in one book, throwing things together that just shouldn't go together.
Stuff that is contradictory.
Yes.
I mean, that's, I guess for me, the takeaway is how much writing a utopia is about writing around the contradictions that are inevitable, that you have to, kind of bump into, and how do you think through them? Because there are points where he says gender is going to be eliminated, women and men are going to wear the exact same clothes, but then like I mentioned, he has that concept where he's forcing women into these birthing institutions, and they're having to listen to that music. I mean,
which is the worst part of the deal, really, when you think about it.
He presents it as a pleasant thing, but certainly we can say that space is gendered. I mean, everything in your life is revolving around women giving birth to kids.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not at all. I mean, he doesn't really kind of resolve these conflicts.
He doesn't, and we're not reading something like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which is this meticulously thought out thing that took him like 25 years to write. This is complicated because Kang is trying to work between a number of different intellectual traditions at the same time. To me, this is one of the reasons it's valuable, because this is the last period in Chinese history when you have serious scholars trying to make very traditional Chinese thinking work with very non-traditional European and American philosophy and science. Kang is arguing, look, this Confucian concept, Ren, it's like electricity. It's like ether. It's like a lot of these things that you see in Western philosophy, and therefore is worth constructing an entire edifice of thought on. Now, of course, when you go back and read the whole thing again, it doesn't hold up. But it's such a fascinating attempt to do this. And there is a writer, sort of a compiler, translator of classical Chinese philosophy named Wing-Sit Chan. And for him, Kang Youwei is the last Confucian philosopher. This is the last person to really add something new to the commentaries on Confucius. And it is this concept of Ren as a force behind all things in nature and the world. Nothing like it had ever been done before, and there had never been anything written before about the future. Like, we know, because of Ren, what the future is going to be like. This is not something that existed before.
I was thinking about how to wrap this up. What do you think Kang Youwei's legacy is? I mean, if his grave has essentially been abandoned and allowed to grow semi-wild in the middle of this major Chinese city, what legacy does Kang Youwei have?
You know, if you study the mainland, like, you know, if I were to talk to some of my old professors at Nankai, they could probably tell me a lot about Kang Youwei. But it's only been recently that mainland Chinese scholars, have been open to the idea that the Late Qing actually wasn't a complete cesspool, because that was the traditional configuration.
When you say traditional configuration, you're talking about the state-sponsored,
the orthodox, exactly.
orthodox communist reading.
The way you're supposed to read it is that the Late Qing was this
kind of period of deadness
and just corruption, and no one knew what they were doing, and people were weak and cowardly and letting foreign powers walk all over them. And then the May 4th kicked the doors open, brought in the fresh air, and everything started to change. The problem being that when you actually read the sources, there was a ton of stuff happening in the Late Qing. And it's only been recently in modern China this is coming about. So I would say right now, Kang Youwei's stock is still pretty low. But if things continue to shift, and they may not, but if they continue to shift in at least Chinese academics, I think you'll see a greater appreciation of Kang Youwei. I don't think he'll ever be a popular figure. His disciple Tan Sitong is the hero, because Tan Sitong actually died a martyr after the 100 Days, rebellion or whatever, whereas Kang Youwei fled, which, in revolutionary politics is the ultimate sin. So,
well, I will have to say, Kang Youwei, in proposing to eliminate marriage, essentially proposed temporary marriage contracts for 1 month through 1 year, renewable if both parties agree. I think, maybe he could be quite popular. That's something.
It's true.
It's essentially the dating world that China is experiencing. So maybe there could be a Chinese dating app.
Just call Kang
Youwei style Chinese dating app.
Go ahead, feel free to design that.
Listener, you have your mission.
Crowdsource this.
All right. Do you have anything else?
That's all I've got.
This is a fun little discussion about something that's kind of on the margins of literature.
Definitely.
And the margins of Chinese thought.
Yep.
I guess we'll call it that. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature